Somewhere in Southeast Asia, buried under centuries of jungle growth, vines and silence, sat the largest city on Earth. Not a village, not a town. A full sprawling metropolis, home to somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people, with roads stretching for miles, canals engineered with mathematical precision, and temples so massive they would have dwarfed anything standing in Europe at the time, and Europe had absolutely no idea it existed. That's the thing that stops you cold when you first encounter this story. Around 1200 AD, while Paris had maybe 200,000 people, and London was still figuring itself out, there was a city in the Cambodian jungle, operating at a scale that the medieval Western world couldn't even have imagined. Kings held court there. Priests performed rituals in stone temples aligned to the stars. Farmers fed hundreds of thousands of people through one of the most sophisticated water management systems ever built in the ancient world. And yet if you had asked a scholar in Rome, a monk in Canterbury, or a merchant in Venice about it, they would have stared at you blankly. How does something that large stay invisible? That's the question at the heart of this story. And the answer, it turns out, is more complicated and more fascinating than just saying the jungle swallowed it. Because the jungle did swallow it, eventually. But even before that, even when it was at the peak of its power, this city existed in a world that operated on completely different information networks than the ones European civilization was plugged into. Trade routes, religious texts, political connections. This city was a centre of gravity for an entirely different half of the medieval world, and the two halves barely overlapped. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Figuring out what this city actually was and how big it truly was required some of the most remarkable detective work in modern archaeology. We're talking ancient stone inscriptions decoded after centuries of silence, maps pieced together from aerial photographs, and then, just in the last couple of decades, something almost science fiction level. Laser technology shot from helicopters that stripped away the jungle canopy digitally and revealed the streets, the neighbourhoods, the hidden structures underneath. Tools that didn't even exist a generation ago suddenly rewriting everything we thought we knew about the medieval world. And what they revealed changed the conversation permanently. Because this wasn't a lost city in the romantic Hollywood sense, some forgotten ruin accidentally stumbled upon. This was a functioning civilization operating at full scale, and the fact that it didn't appear in European records says far less about its importance, and far more about how narrow our definition of medieval history has always been. The centres of the medieval world were not all in Europe, not even close. That's what this story is really about. Not just a city, but what it means that a city this significant could exist for centuries and be effectively invisible to one entire half of the world's civilizations. What does that tell us about whose stories we've been paying attention to and whose we've been missing? Before we get into the full picture of how this city worked, how it grew, how it eventually fell, and how we finally found it again, I want to pause for a second. Because this community watching from everywhere at once is honestly one of my favourite things about making these. So drop a comment right now, tell me where you are and what time it is. Seriously, it's one of those things where you'll see someone from Tokyo at midnight next to someone from Toronto eating lunch, and it just hits different. Now, let's go back to a jungle that was hiding the medieval world's best-kept secret. Before we can talk about Angkor being the largest city on Earth, we need to talk about what that claim actually means. Because it sounds simple. Larger city, straightforward enough, but the moment you start pulling on that thread, it unravels into something much more complicated, and honestly much more interesting. Here's the problem. When historians and archaeologists try to estimate the population of any medieval city, they're working with fragmentary evidence, incomplete records, and methods that can produce wildly different numbers depending on what assumptions you plug in. A scholar looking at tax records might get one figure, an archaeologist counting household foundations might get another, a demographer modelling agricultural output and caloric requirements might get a third, and all three of those people could be doing rigorous legitimate work and still disagree by hundreds of thousands of people. Medieval population estimates are, to put it generously, educated guesses built on top of other educated guesses. Some of those guesses are better supported than others, but none of them are the kind of clean, census-backed numbers we'd use today. And that's before you even get to the deeper question, which is, what exactly counts as a city? This sounds like the kind of philosophical debate that only matters to academics, but it actually determines everything when you're comparing urban centres across different cultures and different parts of the world. Because city is not a neutral, universal concept. It's a category shaped by the civilizations that developed it. In medieval Europe, a city meant something specific. Walls, a dense urban core. Markets, churches, administrative buildings packed together within a defined boundary. Population concentrated inside a perimeter. That model is so deeply embedded in how we think about cities that we often apply it unconsciously to urban centres everywhere else in the world. And when we do that, we make serious mistakes. Think about what we mean when we say Paris had 200,000 people in 1200 AD. We're counting the people living within a relatively compact, densely built area. Dense streets, multi-story buildings, people living practically on top of each other. That's one model of how a large human population organizes itself in space. But it's not the only model, and here's where Angkor starts to break your brain a little. Angkor was not a walled city. There was no single perimeter, no clear line where the city ended and the countryside began. What archaeologists have mapped is something that looks fundamentally different from any European urban centre of the same period. A vast, low-density landscape stretching across hundreds of square miles, with temple complexes as focal points, surrounded by networks of roads, canals, residential areas, rice paddies, and smaller settlements, all integrated into a single functioning urban system. Not a city surrounded by farmland, a city that incorporated the farmland, a city where the agricultural infrastructure was part of the urban infrastructure. Researchers have called this low-density urbanism, and it's a genuinely different way of thinking about what cities can be. Instead of vertical density, you get horizontal spread. Instead of walls defining the boundary, you get a web of connections defining the network. The water channels link the neighbourhoods. The roads connect the temple complexes to the residential zones, to the markets, to the agricultural fields. The whole thing works as one organism, even though it sprawls across a landscape that, by European standards, would look more like a region than a city. So when we say Angkor was the largest city on Earth around 1200 AD, we need to be precise about what we're measuring. If you're measuring the dense urban core, the central area around the major temple complexes, you get one number. If you're measuring the full extent of the metropolitan landscape, the entire interconnected system of settlements, canals, and agricultural zones that functioned as a unified urban environment, you get a dramatically larger number. Some estimates for the full urban footprint put it at over 1,000 square kilometres. That's not a city in the European sense. That's something without a clean equivalent in the medieval Western world. Now here's where written records versus archaeology creates another layer of confusion. European cities from this period are relatively well documented. Medieval chronicles, tax records, church registers, merchant accounts. Imperfect, yes, but they exist in quantity. They give historians a written framework to work from, even when that framework has gaps. And because European historians wrote about European cities, and those written traditions were the ones that survived and got studied, and built the foundation of Western historical scholarship, the cities that appear in those records feel more real, more legible, more easy to measure. Angkor left a different kind of record. Stone inscriptions, temple reliefs, administrative texts written in Sanskrit and Old Khmer. Rich in some ways, sparse in others. There are no equivalent of parish birth records or detailed tax surveys that would let you count households the way European demographic historians can sometimes approximate. What there is instead is an extraordinary physical record. The city's infrastructure survived in the landscape itself, waiting to be read by the right tools. For a long time, those tools didn't exist. You couldn't see the full extent of Angkor from the ground because the jungle had reclaimed most of it. You could walk through the ruins of the great temples and understand that something enormous had existed here, but the full picture was invisible. Written records couldn't give it to you because the written record was incomplete. Ground-level archaeology couldn't give it to you because the scale was too vast and the vegetation too dense. So for generations, estimates were conservative, shaped by what was visible rather than by what was there. That created a systematic bias. The cities we had good written records for, mostly European and Middle Eastern centres, looked larger and more significant in the historical literature than cities we knew about primarily through archaeology or partial records. Not because they actually were larger, but because our evidence was skewed by what survived and what got written down by whom. Which brings us to where we actually are with Angkor. The best supported view, based on the most comprehensive archaeological mapping conducted in the last 2 decades, is that Angkor's full urban landscape was almost certainly the most extensive in the world for its period. Population estimates for the metropolitan area range from several 100,000 to over 1 million people, with most serious scholars settling somewhere in the middle range and acknowledging significant uncertainty on both ends. Some of that uncertainty will probably never be fully resolved. We're working backward from physical remains, not from a census. What we can say with much more confidence is that the infrastructure built to support that population was extraordinary, that the agricultural systems feeding that many people required a level of engineering sophistication that rivals anything happening elsewhere in the medieval world, and that the spatial extent of the urban landscape was genuinely without parallel in the 12th and 13th centuries. So when we say largest city on Earth, we mean the most expansive, most populated urban system we currently have evidence for in that period. Not the densest, not the one with the tallest buildings, not the one that would look most like a city to a European of the time, but a city by a different set of rules, a different logic of urban organisation that was perfectly adapted to its environment and its civilization and its way of understanding how people should live together in large numbers. Keep that in mind as we go further, because almost everything surprising about Angkor comes back to this one idea. It was operating by a different definition of what a city could be. And once you stop applying the European template and start seeing it on its own terms, the scale of what was built there becomes genuinely staggering. To understand how something that large came to exist, you have to go back further, because Angkor didn't appear out of nowhere. It wasn't a sudden inspiration, a single king's vision imposed on an empty landscape. It was the culmination of centuries of political experimentation, agricultural innovation, and cultural synthesis happening across a region that most people in the medieval world had never heard of and couldn't have found on a map. Mainland Southeast Asia in the first millennium AD was not a backwater. It was one of the most strategically valuable pieces of real estate on the planet. The region sat directly between the 2 largest economic powers in the ancient world, India to the west and China to the north. Maritime trade routes connecting those 2 civilizations had to pass through or around the Indo-Chinese peninsula. Whoever controlled the river valleys and coastal ports of what is now Cambodia, Vietnam and Thailand sat at a choke point in a trading network moving spices, silk, ceramics and precious metals across half the known world. That geographic position meant wealth, and wealth meant power, and power attracted ambition. The early Khmer polities that emerged across this landscape were not unified kingdoms in the way we might imagine. They were networks of competing regional centres, each built around a local strongman or lineage group that had figured out how to translate agricultural surplus into political authority. Chinese sources from the early centuries AD describe a polity they called Funan, centred somewhere in the lower Mekong Delta, that grew wealthy from maritime trade and seems to have acted as a regional broker, extracting tolls and offering services to merchants moving between east and west. Later came Chenla, another broad Chinese term that probably described a loose collection of Khmer-speaking polities that gradually absorbed or eclipsed Funan as the centre of regional gravity shifted inland. What was driving that shift inland mattered enormously, and it comes down to something unglamorous but absolutely fundamental: rice and water. The lower Mekong and Tonle Sap systems created one of the most productive agricultural environments on Earth. The Tonle Sap Lake, which sits at the heart of the Cambodian plain, does something unusual. During the monsoon season, the Mekong floods with such force that it actually reverses the flow of the Tonle Sap River, pushing water back into the lake and expanding it to several times its dry season size. When the floods recede, they leave behind vast areas of extraordinarily fertile, nutrient-rich soil. The fish populations in the lake explode with the flooding cycle, providing protein at a scale that few other environments in the pre-modern world could match. This was not just good farmland. This was a natural system almost perfectly calibrated for supporting very large numbers of people. But harnessing that system required management. Water doesn't distribute itself evenly. Rice paddies need irrigation at the right moments and drainage at others. A good harvest in one location might mean nothing if the next location downstream is flooded past the point of use. Managing water at scale meant coordinating labour at scale, and coordinating labour at scale required political authority capable of making and enforcing decisions across large communities. In mainland Southeast Asia, control of water wasn't just an agricultural tool. It was the mechanism of political power. The ruler who could manage the water could manage the people who depended on the water. The two things were inseparable. This is also where the cultural picture gets complicated in ways worth sitting with for a moment. The early Khmer world absorbed enormous influences from India. Sanskrit became the language of elite inscription and religious ceremony. Hindu cosmology shaped how rulers understood and presented their authority. Buddhist traditions layered in alongside and sometimes in competition with Brahmanical practice. Artistic styles, architectural conventions, ritual calendars, legal concepts, all of these arrived through networks of trade, pilgrimage, and itinerant priests and scholars. But calling this simple Indianization misses something important. The Khmer world didn't just receive Indian culture. It filtered it, adapted it, combined it with local practices, and produced something genuinely its own. Local traditions of ancestor veneration and territorial spirits got woven together with Sanskrit cosmology. Royal legitimacy didn't work the same way in Cambodia as it did in any Indian kingdom. The specific forms of divine kingship that would eventually produce Angkor's extraordinary temple mountains were Khmer inventions built from a mixture of borrowed and indigenous materials. The people doing this synthesis were not passive recipients of a foreign tradition. They were active architects of a new one. The earlier capitals that preceded Angkor show this process playing out in real time. Sites like Sambor Prey Kuk, which was the capital of an early Chenla polity in the 7th century, already show sophisticated hydraulic engineering alongside temple complexes that combine Indian structural ideas with distinctly local arrangements. Each successive political centre built on what came before, experimenting with new scales of construction, new organisational methods, new ways of mobilising the labour required to build in stone rather than wood. And behind all of this, at every level, were people whose names we mostly don't know. The farmers who worked the paddies and understood the flood cycles from generations of observation. The labourers who dug the canals and shaped the earthworks that made large-scale irrigation possible. The administrators who kept track of which fields owed what in tax and which villages owed how many days of corvée labour. The priests and scholars who maintained the Sanskrit literary tradition and performed the rituals that legitimised the whole political structure. The craftsmen who transmitted building techniques from one generation to the next, refining them through practice in ways that no single inscription records. By the time the rulers who would build Angkor came to power in the 9th century, they were not starting from zero. They were inheriting a tradition of hydraulic engineering, monumental construction, administrative organisation, and religious synthesis that had been developing for at least 4 centuries. What they did with that inheritance was scale it up to something no one had yet attempted. But that ambition didn't come from nowhere. It came from a world that had spent generations figuring out what was possible. When a new centre finally crystallised on the plain north of Tonle Sap in the 9th century, it wasn't obvious that this one would be different. Khmer rulers had moved capitals before. They had built temples, dug canals, claimed divine favour. What turned Angkor from just another royal foundation into a machine for growth was not a single invention, but the way politics, religion and engineering were fused into one operating system. At the core of that operating system was a particular way of being king. In the inscriptions, rulers are not just war leaders or estate managers. They are cosmic actors. A Khmer king, especially from the time of Jayavarman II onward, claimed a role that historians often summarise with the term Devaraya, the god-king. The idea was not as simple as the king is a god now. It was more like this. The king is the unique human through whom divine order is anchored to a specific piece of land. In practice, that meant a ruler didn't just inherit authority. He had to have it ritually installed. Priests consecrated a central linga or image, often identified with Shiva, sometimes with other deities, on a specially prepared mountain temple. That image was not just another idol. It represented the fusion of god, king, and territory. As long as the cult was properly maintained, the inscriptions tell us, the rains would come, the rice would grow, the kingdom would hold together. Withdraw divine favour, neglect the rituals, and everything could fall apart. That sounds abstract, but it had concrete consequences. Religion here was not a weekend activity. It was the operating manual for government. Temple building was how a king proved he could keep the cosmos running. Raising a new temple mountain, digging a new reservoir, installing a new cult were public statements. The god favours me, therefore you can trust your labour and your harvest to my rule. Every stone block hauled into place, every canal length excavated, every rice field donated to support the temple's priests and staff was a line in that political argument. This made temples into something we don't usually think of them as, administrative engines. An Angkorian temple, especially the big state temples, was part palace, part bureaucracy, part warehouse, part ritual theatre. Inscriptions carved on their doorframes read like spreadsheets in verse, lists of villages assigned to provide rice, oil, honey, cloth, and labour, inventories of agricultural land, herds, and ponds, rosters of temple personnel from high-ranking priests to musicians, dancers, and cooks. To endow a temple, a king had to survey territory, assign rights, and fix obligations. Doing that created records, boundaries, and expectations. Villagers discovered that they now belonged to this or that foundation. Farmers found their paddy counted as part of a specific endowment. Local elites were drawn into temple management as stewards and officials. A sacred monument on a hill translated into a network of very worldly relationships. And Angkor multiplied these nodes. From the 9th through the 12th centuries, each major king inherited a landscape studded with earlier shrines and foundations, then added his own. New temples, new reservoirs, new embankments, new roads. None of these projects was just a piece of piety or vanity. Each one stitched more of the countryside into a single system. Think about what happens when you run a raised road, straight as an arrow, from Angkor out to a distant shrine. That road becomes more than a way for pilgrims to move. It's a military route, a tax artery, a line along which markets pop up and villages cluster. Put rest houses and small shrines along it, as Angkorian kings did all the way to the frontiers, and you get pre-modern infrastructure that can carry orders, goods, news, and people faster and more reliably than before. Now add water. The Angkor Plain was already a good place to grow rice. But what the kings did, step by step, was turn that environment into a controllable machine. Large Barre reservoirs caught and stored monsoon rains and river water. Canals connected Barre to fields, fields to rivers, rivers to the lake. Smaller embankments and channels branched off like capillaries. The system was not one single master plan. It changed over generations, but the cumulative effect was to make more land reliably irrigable for longer parts of the year. When water could be moved, harvests became more predictable. When harvests were more predictable, the state could demand more rice as tax, more corvée days digging dikes or hauling stone, more support for ever larger temple foundations. And when the state could demand more, it could build more infrastructure to make harvests even more reliable. That is the snowball. Each successful project, the opening of a new reservoir, the dedication of a giant temple like Bakong or later Angkor Wat, the extension of a road toward a frontier region, generated its own momentum. New infrastructure fed new surplus. Surplus funded further construction. Construction bound more people and places into the Angkor system. More people and places meant more capacity to extract and project power. It's positive feedback written in laterite and sandstone. But none of this worked as simple top-down command. The vision of an all-powerful god-king barking orders and watching tens of thousands of obedient workers march into the jungle is tempting. But it doesn't fit the evidence. Inscriptions constantly emphasize gifts, negotiations and confirmations. Kings request land from local notables, who in turn receive titles or religious merit. Communities donate ponds and rice fields to temples in exchange for spiritual benefits, social prestige, or a degree of protection. Power at Angkor had to be maintained, not just imposed. The king's divine status was a claim that needed constant reinforcement through ritual, largesse, and visible success. A failed harvest, an unfinished reservoir, a temple whose cult fell into neglect. These were not just practical problems. They were political vulnerabilities. Local elites could shift loyalties. Villages could quietly resist labor demands. Priests could support rival claimants with different ritual lineages. So the machine for growth was also a machine for persuasion and coordination. Temple ceremonies dramatized cosmic order, but they also brought elites to the capital. Renewed oaths, distributed favors. Road networks carried military contingents, but they also facilitated trade in salt, iron, ceramics, and forest products, giving communities reasons to stay plugged into the Angkor system. Waterworks increased yields, but they also created shared dependencies. If the main canal that fed your paddies depended on maintenance organized from Angkor, your harvest, your local authority, Your village's survival were all entangled with the fortunes of the king. Over 3 centuries, this entanglement deepened. What began as one more royal centre grew into something qualitatively different, a landscape where politics, religion and engineering had become so tightly braided that they reinforced one another almost automatically. The more Angkor built, the more it could build. The more people it fed, the more labour it could mobilise to reshape the land yet again. Outsiders sailing along the coasts of Southeast Asia had no idea that far inland this machine was humming. But on the ground, in the paddies and along the canals, in the courtyards of hundreds of temples large and small, millions of people were living inside a system that had turned a monsoon plain into the engine of the largest city on Earth. To see how that engine actually worked day to day, you have to look at its most critical component, the water itself. For most of the year, Angkor lived on a knife edge between too much water and not enough. The Khmer world ran on the monsoon. From roughly May to October, warm, moisture-heavy air rolled in from the Indian Ocean and dumped staggering amounts of rain across mainland Southeast Asia. Rivers swelled, streams turned into torrents. The great Tonle Sap Lake to the south of Angkor performed one of the strangest tricks in hydrology. As the Mekong swelled with monsoon flood, the Tonle Sap River literally reversed direction and pushed water back into the lake, inflating it to several times its dry season size. Then, almost as sharply, the tap turned off. From November to April, the sky could stay empty for months. Temperatures climbed, small streams withered to chains of puddles. Fields that had been under a metre of water in September became cracked and dusty by March. If you relied only on what fell from the sky, you were trapped in a brutal rhythm, frantic planting and transplanting during the rains, then a long, anxious wait to see if what you'd put in the mud would make it to harvest. Managing these seasonal extremes wasn't a matter of convenience, it was existential. Too little control, and a bad monsoon meant famine, migration, and political collapse. Too much water in the wrong place at the wrong time, flooded fields just as the rice was ripening, embankments breached, villages washed out, and you could lose a year's subsistence in a week. In this landscape, power belonged to whoever could tame the monsoon without breaking it. That is what Angkor's rulers tried to do. When you look at the Angkor Plain today from satellite or LiDAR images, you don't just see one big reservoir and some random ditches. You see an artificial watershed, an entire lowland resculpted so that water moved, pooled, slowed and spilled in ways that suited human plans. The big features get the most attention, the berets. Each beret was a rectangular reservoir on a scale that feels almost absurd. The East Beret, about 7 by 1.8 kilometres. The West Beret, more than 8 kilometres long with an area of around 16 square kilometres. These are not ponds. They are inland seas held in place by earthen embankments tens of metres wide at the base, faced and stabilised with laterite and sandstone. Water flowed into them from multiple sources, diverted streams, seasonal runoff from the Kulin Hills to the north, channels from the Siem Reap River. From the berets, a branching network of canals carried water out again, sometimes toward the Tonle Sap, sometimes sideways across the plain, sometimes directly into field systems. But the genius of the system was not just big tank, long ditch. It was in the way every piece connected to every other. Embankments that served as barrier walls also doubled as roads. Spillways cut through those embankments weren't afterthoughts. They were precision points where excess water could be bled off at controlled rates. Secondary ponds and small reservoirs were strung along canals like beads. Sluices and subtle gradients meant that a rise of just a few centimetres in one place could send water trickling or rushing into another. Think of it as a circulatory system. Monsoon water was the blood. The berets were the great hearts, pumping and holding. The canals were the arteries and veins. The capillaries were the feeder ditches and field-bund embankments that brought moisture right up to the root zone of rice plants. Each year, as the rains came, the system inhaled, catching flood peaks, spreading them out, soaking fields. As the dry season advanced, it exhaled more slowly, releasing stored water, keeping soils damp enough for rice to finish ripening, for second crops in some areas, for fish and aquatic plants that supplemented the diet. More control over when and where water sat on the land meant more control over rice. Rice is a finicky crop in one sense and incredibly forgiving in another. It thrives when you can keep its feet wet but its head above water. If Angkorian engineers could hold floodwaters just long enough, drain them at the right moment, and then feed fields with canal water later in the season, they could extend the effective growing window. That might mean an extra harvest in some zones. More often, it meant that a single main crop was far more likely to succeed even in a weird year. Higher, more reliable yields did not automatically translate into more people, but they made it possible. A dense urban core like Angkor, with tens or hundreds of thousands of people clustered around the temples, could not live on backyard paddies alone. It depended on a ring of intensively managed agricultural land, much of it threaded through with canals, bunds and ponds, the whole system tuned to the monsoon's pulses. The surplus from those fields, rice collected as tax, temple endowments or corvée obligations, fed priests, artisans, soldiers and construction crews. It filled granaries that could buffer bad years. It gave rulers something immensely powerful in a monsoon world, the ability to smooth out risk. And with risk management came authority. When inscriptions proclaim that under a righteous king the rains fall in due season and the land is fertile, they are doing more than echoing a generic agrarian cliché. They are pointing, indirectly, at a visible reality. Embankments held, canals flowed, paddies greened on schedule. A king who opened a new beret or canal system could quite literally claim to have made new land, conjured fresh fertility out of seasonal chaos. Communities whose livelihoods depended on a particular canal had good reasons, material and spiritual, to see that canal, and the power that maintained it, as legitimate. This is where the line between practical and symbolic begins to blur. Were the berets giant irrigation systems designed to feed fields? Or were they cosmic oceans, monumental reflections of Hindu and Buddhist cosmology, more about ritual than rice? Scholars have argued passionately on both sides. Some point out that parts of the beret network don't line up neatly with known field systems, or that water levels were too high or too low for simple gravity-fed irrigation. Others counter with new LiDAR-based maps of paddy grids, suggesting more areas may have been watered than we once realized. The most plausible picture is that the same structures did both jobs, at different times, in different ways. A beret could anchor a temple mountain symbolizing Mount Meru rising from the primeval sea and still be a major piece of flood management infrastructure. A spillway could be both an engineering solution and a ritually charged threshold, where water, personified as a deity, entered and left royal space. The act of dredging a canal might be organized as a merit-making festival. The flow of water itself could be read as a sign of cosmic favor. What made this whole machine both powerful and fragile was its complexity. Because everything was connected, small failures could ripple outward. A poorly maintained embankment breaches in a big storm. The sudden release scours canals downstream. Silt chokes inlets. Fields that depended on a certain water level now get either too much or too little. A change in one king's building priorities, like shifting the main beret focus from east to west, could reorient flows and leave older sections underused. In a wet sequence of years, these stresses might be invisible. In a cluster of droughts or unusually intense monsoons, they could cascade into widespread disruption. For centuries, though, the system mostly worked. Generation after generation of engineers, officials, monks and villagers tweaked embankments, cut new channels, patched leaks, and cleared silt. Their labour turned seasonal violence into predictable cycles, enough to sustain what may have been the largest urban concentration on Earth. Inside that hydraulic web, people did something even more remarkable. They built lives. To see what it meant to live in a city woven out of water and jungle, you have to zoom in from the berets and canals to the neighbourhoods and households strung along their banks. Zoom in far enough, and Angkor stops looking like a diagram of canals and starts looking like a tangle of lives. You're standing on one of those earthen embankments that also serves as a road. On one side, a canal, its water-stained tea-brown, sluggish in the dry season, rushing and high during the rains. On the other side, a line of house plots runs back from the road like teeth on a comb. Almost none of those houses exist anymore. Angkor's famous temples are carved from sandstone and laterite. Everyday Angkor was built from materials the jungle loves: wood, bamboo, thatch, rattan, palm leaves. A decent Khmer house might last a couple of generations if it was kept up. Leave it alone for a few decades in a tropical climate, and it rots into the ground. Termites eat the beams, roofs collapse, floodwaters rearrange the soil. Later families scavenge the posts and planks for their own structures or firewood. Over centuries, new houses rise on top of old ones, slightly shifting, slightly reorienting, until any hard edges in the archaeological record blur into stains in the earth. That's why, when archaeologists map Angkor today, what they often see is not buildings, but patterns. Rectangular mounds where house platforms once stood, shallow depressions that were once ponds, family reservoirs, fish ponds, water sources, ritual spaces, narrow raised strips marking field buns, a scatter of broken ceramics, an occasional laterite footing stone where a post once rested. Enough traces, when multiplied across hundreds of square kilometres, to reconstruct a city. Picture a typical neighbourhood. Closer to a major temple or along an important road, house plots are packed more tightly. Wooden houses stand raised on stilts to keep living floors above seasonal floods and to create shaded space underneath for animals, storage and work. Roofs are steep and thatched. A few wealthier households might use tile. Farther out, plots stretch, and rice fields push right up against the back of the Jujai mounds. Small ponds sit beside many houses, catching rain and canal overflow, doubling as laundries, fish traps and bathtubs. Between these clusters rise the things that did survive: monasteries, shrines, temples. Not every religious building was a sandstone giant like Angkor Wat. Many were modest brick towers, wooden halls on masonry platforms, or monastic compounds with a stone core and perishable superstructures. Around them grew what you might call Angkor's spiritual suburbs: monks' dwellings, kitchens, preaching halls, libraries. Inscriptions speak of monasteries endowed with rice fields, ponds and workers, integrating religious life into the very fabric of the city. Monks and nuns weren't tucked away on distant hills. They lived amid the noise and smoke of everyday Angkor, teaching, copying texts, performing rituals, managing land. Socially, this landscape was stratified, but not in simple layers stacked one atop another. It was more like a web. At the top were elites, royal families, high officials, major temple patrons. They lived in compounds we can barely see now because their residences were also mostly wood. What gives them away are clues: unusually large mounds, traces of stone boundary walls, inscriptions recording grants of land and labour. Their wealth came from offices, control of waterworks, rights to rice harvests and corvée labour, and their proximity to temples where political and cosmic authority overlapped. Below and around them were specialists, artisans who carved stone, cast bronze, hammered gold and lacquered wood, brickmakers and tile burners, boat builders and carpenters. Many of these crafts left indirect fingerprints. Mounds thick with slag suggest metalworking. Piles of wasters, misfired or broken pots, mark ceramic workshops. Tools survive in temple deposits and in the fill of later constructions: chisels, adzes, spindle whorls. Then you have the people whose names almost never made it into inscriptions, but whose work fed the city's metabolism. Rice farmers managing paddies in the shadow of embankments. Porters and cart drivers moving grain, stone and timber along the road canal grid. Market vendors ladling rice porridge and fish stew. Seasonal labourers drafted to dredge canals or haul sandstone blocks during the dry season, then returning to their villages for planting. Religious specialists formed another thread through this society. Not just monks, but Brahmins, ritual experts, astrologers, scribes. In an Angkorian inscription, a temple is as much a bureaucracy as a sanctuary. It lists positions: supervisors of dancers, keepers of lamps, custodians of fields. These roles tied elite religion to the labour and offerings of thousands of ordinary people. What did they all eat? Rice, almost certainly, at nearly every meal for those who could get it. But not just rice. The canals and ponds doubled as fisheries. Excavations and lake cores suggest a heavy reliance on freshwater fish from the Tonle Sap system. Catfish, carp, snakehead, and many others, preserved by drying or fermenting. Shellfish and crabs from rice paddies. Wild and semi-domesticated plants, lotus seeds and roots, water spinach, bamboo shoots. Fruit trees like coconut, banana, jackfruit and mango likely dotted houseplots. There is evidence for domestic animals: pigs, chickens, cattle, water buffalo, though how much meat people ate probably varied a lot with status and season. Spices, herbs and fermented products filled out the flavour profile. We don't have recipe books, but residue analysis and ethnographic parallels hint at salty, sour and funky staples, fermented fish pastes, pickled vegetables, herb-rich broths. It was a cuisine built on water and rice, but also on biodiversity, the sheer variety of things that a wet tropical landscape could provide when carefully managed. Inside this city, production never stopped. Potters turned out huge storage jars and fine tableware, some for local use, some for temples. Weaving and textile dyeing transformed cotton and other fibres into cloth. In temple reliefs you can see patterned garments, suggesting a fashion world we can only glimpse. Woodworkers crafted everything from boat hulls to ceremonial palanquins. Bronze casters poured bells, gongs and statues, using techniques that required coordinated teams and expert knowledge. Trade tied Angkor outward. Imported ceramics from China show up in elite contexts, alongside glass beads and occasionally semi-precious stones. Some goods moved along the Mekong Tonle Sap corridor, others came overland from the coast. In exchange, Angkor seems to have exported rice, forest products, perhaps textiles, and probably prestige goods framed in the language of tribute and diplomacy. Even in the largest city on earth, daily life depended on people you would never meet, in places you would never see. All of this, diet, crafts, trade, social roles, is something we reconstruct from fragments. House timbers are gone, market stalls vanished, boat docks rotted away, flood pulses erased paths and repainted the soil layers again and again. Vegetation covered everything. Later villagers ploughed up old mounds and built new hamlets atop Angkor's ghost neighbourhoods, yet the pattern remains. The stone monuments are just the anchors. Around them spread a living city, wooden houses on stilts strung like beads along canals, smoke from cooking fires mixing with temple incense, children swimming in ponds beside rice fields, monks chanting in wooden halls as porters trudge by with baskets of grain. Angkor was never just a collection of temples in the jungle. It was a place where tens or hundreds of thousands of people woke up, worried about harvests and taxes, fell in love, made deals, made offerings, and went to bed under creaking thatch roofs. To understand the scale of that world, you have to zoom out again, from the household to the whole urban field, and trace how those houses, ponds, roads, and fields stitched together into a metropolis that barely left a footprint in stone. And yet, when most people think of Angkor, they don't picture any of that. They picture one building, a lotus of stone rising out of a moat, endless galleries of carvings, towers stacked like stepped mountains. Angkor Wat has become shorthand for the whole civilization, the way the Colosseum stands in for Rome, or the pyramids for ancient Egypt. But Angkor Wat was never the city, it was a statement. In the early 12th century, King Suryavarman II ordered its construction as his state temple and eventual tomb. Dedicated to Vishnu, it was part sanctuary, part palace of the gods, part royal billboard. Its plan is a cosmology in 3 dimensions. The outer moat is not just a defensive ditch, it's an ocean, encircling the world. The concentric enclosures you pass through are continents. The central quincunx of towers is Mount Meru, the Axis Mundi, the home of the gods. The temple faces west, unusual in Angkor, which many scholars link to its funerary function and to Vishnu's associations. Every step inward pulls you, literally, toward the divine centre and symbolically toward the king's claim to occupy that centre. On the walls, the message gets spelled out in extraordinary detail. Kilometres of bas-reliefs show Hindu epics, battles, processions of soldiers and courtiers. The famous churning of the Sea of Milk spreads across one gallery, gods and demons hauling on a giant serpent wrapped around a cosmic mountain to churn out the elixir of immortality. At one level it's mythology, at another it's political allegory. The king is the axis, holding the cosmos steady while opposing forces pull. Order triumphs, immortality flows. If you were an elite walking those galleries in the 12th century, the lesson would be clear. This ruler is not just powerful, he is the pivot of the universe. But the temple's story doesn't stop with its founder. A century after Suryavarman II, Angkor's religious landscape began to shift. Mahayana Buddhism rose at court under Jayavarman VII. Temples were rededicated, new ones were built with Buddha images at their hearts. Angkor Wat, though, was too big and too important to abandon. It seems to have continued functioning, gradually absorbing Buddhist practices. By the 16th century, long after Angkor's political centre had migrated, the temple was firmly Buddhist. Local kings restored parts of it. Monks moved in. Buddha statues took over spaces originally carved for Hindu deities. Today, saffron-robed monks and Buddhist shrines occupy a monument laid out as a Vishnuic, royal funerary temple. The stone stayed, the meanings moved. That's one of the reasons Angkor Wat is so valuable to historians. It's a palimpsest. Inscriptions carved in sandstone door jambs record donations, rituals, ranks, land grants. They tell us about officials who managed temple estates, villages that owed rice or labour, festivals that required offerings. They show how closely state power, sacred space, and economic extraction intertwined. But we have to be careful about what we ask a monument like this to tell us. Angkor Wat can show us how a king wanted to be seen. It encodes his cosmology, his claims to legitimacy, his network of priests and administrators. It hints at the labour regime that could mobilise tens of thousands of workers, quarrying sandstone dozens of kilometres away, hauling blocks on rafts and ox carts, shaping and fitting them with precision, covering surfaces with carvings that required specialised teams of artists and apprentices. The logistics alone speak volumes. Quarries at Phnom Kulin and other sites fed the project. Cutting stone required iron tools, which meant smelting, charcoal production, distribution networks. Transport meant boats, carts, draft animals, drivers. Food had to be supplied to corvée labourers: rice, fish, salt. Supervisors coordinated schedules with the monsoon, moving heavy loads when water levels were right, carving and raising towers when foundations had settled. Someone planned this at the scale of decades. That is state capacity written in stone. What the temple cannot do is give us a census. Looking at Angkor Wat's bulk, it's tempting to imagine 1 million people bustling around it. But monumental architecture often overshoots the daily realities of the society that built it. A relatively small elite, riding on the backs of a much larger agrarian population, can produce enormous buildings without those buildings sitting in the middle of a dense urban core. You can't read population size directly off the height of a tower. For that, we have to go back to the subtle traces. The ponds, the house mounds, the ceramic scatters, the LiDAR-mapped grids of roads and embankments stretching far beyond the temple's moat. Angkor Wat is the anchor point, the thing that catches your eye and refuses to let go. But from its galleries, if you could rewind the clock to 1200, you wouldn't see a lonely masterpiece in a sea of jungle. You'd see roads radiating outward, dotted with shrines and rest houses. You'd see processions of pilgrims and porters, carts creaking under rice and stone, smoke from thousands of kitchens rising beyond the reservoirs. To understand Angkor, you start at Angkor Wat. Then you follow the lines that run out from its gates, roads, canals, causeways, into the vast, low-lying city that made such a monument possible. Follow those lines far enough, and something strange happens. The postcard Angkor, the single temple in the jungle, falls apart. In its place you start to see a web. For a long time, archaeologists knew there were other temples scattered around Angkor Wat. The Bayon at Angkor Thom, Ta Prohm, Preah Khan, a whole constellation of stone monuments. But that still fits a familiar mental model. A royal capital dotted with big religious buildings. What broke that model was the realization that the real city wasn't the stone at all. It was the dirt. Around Angkor Wat, if you walk the sandy tracks and scrubby fields, you'll notice low, rounded rises. They don't look like much, maybe a foot, maybe a metre above the surrounding ground. In the dry season they hold a different colour of grass. After rain, water gathers around their bases. Those are house mounds. Over centuries, people living in a floodplain slowly raise up the places they sleep. They pile household trash, broken pottery, sweepings from the yard. They throw on termite mounds, bits of laterite, anything solid. Flood after flood, they patch and build. By the time a neighbourhood has been occupied for generations, the houses sit on little artificial islands, just high enough to stay dry when the rice fields go under. Next to those mounds, almost always, are ponds. Angkor's ponds were not decorative garden features. They were water tanks, for drinking, for bathing, for soaking rice, for ritual. They might start as borrow pits from digging out soil to build the house platforms, then get deepened, squared off, lined. Over time they become permanent parts of the landscape, linked to families, lineages, monasteries. If you plot thousands of those mounds and ponds on a map around Angkor Wat, patterns emerge. They line up in rows, they form grids, they cluster along raised linear embankments that, when you follow them, keep going far beyond the tourist zone. Those embankments are causeways, roads lifted just high enough that carts and pedestrians can move during the wet season. On either side you see faint traces of field boundaries, low ridges, ditches, rectilinear patches of slightly higher or lower ground. That's the field grid, the footprint of planned agriculture. This is how Angkor turned from a collection of temples into a city in the eyes of archaeologists, not by discovering some lost palace, but by realizing the empty green around the temples was full of these small repeating signatures of habitation. LIDAR, airborne laser scanning, made that shift impossible to ignore. When teams flew over Angkor in the 2000s and stripped away the vegetation in their data, they didn't just see the big berets and famous causeways. They saw checkerboards of ponds, dense bands of mounds radiating from temple enclosures, regularized blocks that looked uncannily like city blocks, except with rice paddies instead of apartment buildings. From above, low-density urbanism takes on a very specific form. Imagine a square kilometre. In a medieval European city that might be packed with streets, walls, houses jammed shoulder to shoulder. At Angkor, the same area might contain a temple compound, a few dozen house mounds, a screen of fruit trees, scattered rice fields, a couple of ponds, a monastery, a minor shrine, and a stretch of raised road cutting through it all. No single point is crowded, but the pattern repeats for kilometre after kilometre. Instead of one dense downtown with a hard edge, you get a soft, sprawling city. High-status temple precincts in the middle, monastic complexes scattered like hubs, neighbourhoods of farmers and specialists strung along the waterworks. Between them, green space, productive space, flooded in the rainy season, dry and crossable in the dry. And Angkor didn't stop at its moat. Follow the great stone causeway from Angkor Wat east or west, and it plugs into something much bigger. Royal roads stretching out to provincial centres, border temples, even the empire's edges. Inscriptions mention rest houses of fire built at regular intervals along these highways, wayside stations where travellers could sleep, pray, and cook. Archaeologists have found their footprints, rectangular buildings beside the road, often near bridges or river crossings. Bridge sites themselves show up as neat alignments of mounds and embankments where the causeways step over streams and canals. The roads tie Angkor Wat to Angkor Thom, to Ta Prohm, to the Great Bares, but they also tie the capital to the countryside. They link to places like Beng Mialia and Preah Khan of Kompong Svei, hundreds of kilometres away, remote temple complexes that functioned as regional hubs, plugged into the same network of pilgrimage, tax, and transport. When archaeologists trace these lines outward, the city of Angkor starts to look less like a dot on a map, and more like a mesh overlaying an entire region. On the ground, that mesh could feel surprisingly rural. You might walk through rice paddies for half an hour between one hamlet and the next, hearing frogs and water buffalo, with a temple tower just visible on the horizon. Yet according to how we think about urbanism today, population density, infrastructure, functional integration, you'd still be in the city. From the air, the logic is clearer. You'd see bands of settlement hugging the embankments that carry roads and canals, pond house pairs repeating like a pattern stamped into the floodplain, field grids aligned to temple axes, suggesting someone coordinated land division on a grand scale. It's urban planning, but not the kind that pours stone everywhere. It's a system that weaves water, agriculture, ritual space and movement into one fabric. And yet, even with LIDAR's X-ray vision, a lot of this picture is still in motion. Not every bump is a house mound. Some are natural, some are later. Ponds can be re-excavated, repurposed, abandoned. The same depression might serve as a quarry, a pond, a trash pit, then a rice field over a span of centuries. Ceramic scatters tell us where people were eating and breaking pots, but tying that to exact population numbers or social status is tricky. Scholars debate how coordinated the whole system really was. Was there a master plan laid out from the palace, or did neighbourhoods grow organically, with planners periodically stepping in to realign roads and canals? Did all those road-linked sites function as a single metropolis at the same time, or did the core shift, pulse, retreat, and expand over generations? As new LIDAR surveys add detail, as excavations ground truth more of those mounds and ponds, interpretations keep evolving. Lines we once read as streets sometimes turn out to be later dikes. Features thought to be purely utilitarian reveal ritual deposits. The map keeps sharpening and changing. What doesn't change is the basic revelation. Angkor was not just a handful of temples in a forest. It was an enormous, loosely woven city, mapped in roads, canals, neighbourhoods and fields, which raises a puzzle. If all of this was here, if millions of tons of earth had been moved, if hundreds of square kilometres were structured by human hands, how did so much of it vanish from sight? How did a metropolis on this scale end up looking, to later visitors, like a few ruins swallowed by trees? To answer that, we have to watch the jungle come back. The first thing to understand is that the jungle is not a backdrop, it's a machine. In a tropical monsoon climate, plants don't politely wait their turn. They attack every gap, every surface, every bit of light. A cleared field wants to become scrub within a year or two. Leave it alone for a decade and it turns into secondary forest. Give it a century, and only a trained eye can tell you it was ever anything else. Angkor's urban fabric was perfect food for that machine. Most of the city wasn't stone. It was wood, thatch, bamboo, packed earth. House frames, verandas, fences, market stalls, workshops, bridges built of timber rather than laterite blocks. When people stopped repairing them, the climate finished the job. Termites, fungi and beetles chewed through beams, roofs fell in, posts rotted at the base. In a few wet seasons, a house became a pile of organic debris. That debris didn't just sit there, seeds fell into it. Vines rooted in it. Saplings sprouted in the gaps where walls had been. Their roots probed down, breaking up whatever hard surfaces they met. Plastered floors, brick footings, collapsed tiles. Leaf litter accumulated, then decomposed, forming a fresh layer of soil on top of the old city. Repeat that process not once, but in overlapping waves for centuries. By the time European travellers started writing breathless accounts of Angkor in the 19th century, many of the empty spaces between the big temples had already gone through multiple cycles of abandonment, reoccupation, cultivation, and regrowth. What they saw as untouched jungle was in many cases forest growing over centuries of human modification. Water helped erase the lines even faster. Angkor was built in a floodplain, on the edge of a great lake whose level rises and falls dramatically each year. In the wet season, rivers swell, spill over their banks and wander. In the dry season they shrink back, leaving behind new bars of sand and silt. Every flood brings sediment. Canals that once had crisp engineered profiles slowly fill. Their edges slump. The tops of dikes and embankments erode, washing into the low spots. Rice fields, which started as flat, carefully levelled plots, become gently undulating as silt piles up here and is scoured away there. Ponds clog with organic muck, their neat rectangular outlines blur into irregular hollows. At Angkor's scale, this process doesn't just soften details, it redraws the map. Over decades, a canal that carried barges might become a sluggish ditch choked with weeds. Over a few centuries it could disappear as a visible watercourse, surviving only as a faint wet depression visible after heavy rain. The water itself shifts into new channels, following whatever path gravity and human tinkering offer. Meanwhile, the rainforest presses in. Tree roots find weaknesses in masonry, prying open joints between stones. Fallen trunks create dams in small streams, diverting water into new routes that undercut old embankments. Epiphytes colonize temple walls, trapping more moisture and organic matter, accelerating decay around even the most monumental structures. So why do we still see the temples? Because they were designed to fight time in a way the rest of the city was not. Royal temples and some monastic complexes were built of sandstone and laterite, on raised platforms, often inside moats. They used durable materials and careful jointing. Even when jungle forces their towers apart, even when galleries collapse, the sheer mass of stone resists total erasure. You can lose roofs and outer walls, but the core piles of masonry remain. Everything around them, the wooden galleries, the palaces, the houses, the markets, is soft architecture, vulnerable not only to decay, but to replacement. After Angkor's political centre shifted, people didn't just vanish. Communities stayed, moved, shrank, grew, adapted. They reused land because it was still valuable land. Slightly drier ground along old embankments, fertile soils where canals once ran, depressions that held water reliably. They also reused materials. Sandstone blocks from collapsed or neglected structures could be quarried in place. A fallen gallery becomes a convenient pile of already shaped stone for a new village shrine, a bridge, or a house foundation. Bricks are pried out of old sanctuaries to line wells, shore up banks, build ovens. Laterite from a disused wall ends up as fill under a new road. Each act is small and practical. Taken together over generations, they scramble the record. A pond that once served a 12th century neighbourhood might be deepened and reshaped by 16th century monks, then turned into a fish pond by a 19th century village, then infilled in the 20th century for a schoolyard. From the ground, you see only the latest phase. The earlier ones are buried under metres of mixed sediment and garbage, or shaved away entirely. This is why so many early visitors could walk through a truly urban landscape without realising it. They saw stone towers poking through trees, Angkor Wat, the Bayon, Ta Prohm, and assumed what they were used to from other parts of the world. Isolated religious monuments in an otherwise rural countryside. Fields, scattered hamlets, jungle. No continuous walls, no dense streets of surviving houses, no obvious skyline of secular buildings. The city's hard skeleton endured in stone. Its soft body, houses, roads, neighbourhoods, the thousands of small decisions that made Angkor a living metropolis, had been composted into the jungle floor, reworked by water and folded into later lives. To an outsider on foot, that looks like ruins in a forest. Only when you step back, strip away the vegetation in the data, and trace the faintest of lines and mounds, does the older reality emerge. Those isolated temples were never alone. Which brings us to another puzzle. If the city's physical presence could be hidden so thoroughly, what about its reputation? How did a metropolis that dominated mainland Southeast Asia for centuries almost disappear from the historical imagination of the people writing the world's most cited chronicles? For that, we have to leave the jungle and turn to Europe. When people ask, why didn't Europe know about Angkor? They're really asking a different question. Why didn't the kinds of people who wrote the books we still read bother to write it down? Because Europe did have information networks, they were just tuned to very specific frequencies. Medieval European scribes were obsessed with certain things: dynasties, church politics, relics, saints' lives, pilgrimages to recognized holy places, the borders of Christendom, and occasionally the deeds of spectacular enemies. News that mattered was news that touched Rome, Constantinople, Jerusalem, or later, the courts of kings and popes. Merchants' gossip and sailors' stories existed, but they rarely made it into the kinds of texts that got lovingly copied for centuries in monastic scriptoria. If you were a monk in Normandy or Bavaria in 1200, and a traveller came through saying, "There's a city in the eastern tropics with stone towers taller than anything you've seen, fed by an artificial lake the size of a small sea," what do you do with that? It doesn't fit into biblical geography. It doesn't help you calculate Easter. It doesn't belong to any of the classical authorities you're supposed to cite. It's not directly useful for preaching, diplomacy, or tax collection. So you nod, you marvel, you maybe repeat the story over dinner. You don't build a new chapter of world history around it. Meanwhile, getting a European to Angkor in the first place was not straightforward. Before the early modern period, there was no direct continuous European presence in mainland Southeast Asia. No chain of fortified trading posts, no consuls sending home regular reports, no missionaries with permanent bases a few days' journey away. To reach Angkor from Europe in, say, 1200, you'd have to move through several separate information worlds that didn't automatically talk to each other. First, across the Mediterranean, then through the Islamic world, Byzantine territories, or the domains of Seljuks, Ayyubids, or later Mamluks. Then into the Indian Ocean trade system, dominated by Arab, Persian, Gujarati, Tamil, Malay, Javanese, and Chinese merchants. Then into the dense multilingual web of Southeast Asian overland and river routes controlled by regional powers, the Khmer, the Mon, various Thai principalities, Cham polities, and others. At every step your status drops. You go from being an insider in Latin Christendom to a tolerated outsider in someone else's commercial network. You depend on local guides, local patrons, local ships, local languages. If you reach Angkor at all, you arrive as a curiosity, not an official envoy with a scribe in tow and a guaranteed audience. Compare that to China. Chinese envoys, traders and pilgrims wrote about the Khmer realm. They described the king, the customs, the wealth, the routes. So did regional chronicles and inscriptions in Sanskrit and Old Khmer. The knowledge was there, detailed and contemporary, but it lived in Chinese characters and Indic scripts, inside archives and traditions that Europeans couldn't read and didn't access. Maritime Asia, in other words, knew perfectly well that Angkor existed. Chinese sailors knew which monsoon would take you to the Cambodian coast and which river led inland. Malay captains knew where to pick up forest products and luxury goods. South Asian merchants knew there was a prosperous kingdom inland from the Mekong Delta, even if they never went there themselves. Europe's records, by contrast, were a narrow slice of a global information system. When Europeans finally began to push into the Indian Ocean in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, they didn't arrive into a blank. They sailed into a trading world with its own maps, pilot books, and mental geographies. But they usually learned just enough of that system to plug in where it benefited them. Ports, spices, strategic choke points. Inland capitals like Angkor, especially ones already fading from political centrality, were not automatic priorities, and even when scraps of information did make it west, they had to pass several filters before they became real knowledge. Someone had to write them down in a language that scribes considered worth copying. Copyists had to find them interesting enough to preserve when parchment was expensive and shelf space limited. Later readers had to believe them. A lone note about a fantastic jungle city, surrounded by more pressing concerns about heresies, taxes, and royal marriages, was easy to ignore, easy to dismiss as exaggeration, easy to lose when a library burned or a monastery declined. So Europe's not knowing is partly technical, no direct roots, no sustained presence, and partly editorial. For medieval European elites, Angkor was outside the map of salvation history, outside the main routes of crusade and pilgrimage, outside the competitive theatre of Christendom versus Islam that structured so much of their worldview. It was not that they proved it didn't exist. They simply had no institutional reason to care. But that absence in European chronicles tells you very little about Angkor's real place in the world. Within Asia, Angkor was plugged into major trade circuits, diplomatic exchanges, religious movements. Its wealth flowed into Chinese account books, into regional myths, into temple foundations from Burma to the Mekong Delta. Its kings negotiated marriages, patronized Buddhist and Hindu institutions, and fought wars whose echoes show up in inscriptions far beyond Cambodia. The city's global significance did not depend on a monk in Paris knowing its name. What it does show is something more uncomfortable for modern readers, a habit of treating what Europe wrote down as a default setting for world history. Angkor exposes how distorted that can be. A metropolis can dominate a region, shape trade, support 1 million people, and leave behind some of the most spectacular architecture on Earth, and still hover at the edges of European awareness, a rumour half heard and never quite believed. To see Angkor clearly, you have to step out of that shadow and back into the jungle, where the story of its rise and fall was written in water and earth long before Europe ever thought to look. By the time Europe was starting to stitch together its own oceanic empires, Angkor was already deep into a long, messy unwinding. Not a single apocalypse. No one day when the bells stopped ringing and the jungle rolled in. More like a very large system being asked century after century to solve problems it hadn't been built for. Start with trade. Angkor's heyday sat in a world where wealth moved largely overland and along short coastal hops. Forest products, rice, precious metals, war captives, luxury crafts, flowing along river systems the Khmer could influence, tax and, when necessary, raid. But over time, the centre of gravity in Asian trade shifted. More and more value ran along open sea routes that Angkor did not directly control. The Malacca Strait, the Java Sea, coastal hubs whose fortunes rose with blue water sailing and big maritime polities. Ports in what is now Thailand, Vietnam, and the Malay world grew fat on this traffic. If you were a merchant with silk to sell or silver to spend, you had options. You could deal with an inland court where your goods moved by slow river convoys under the eye of palace officials, or you could stay near the seaboard, in a port city that spoke the languages of the Indian Ocean, where customs could be negotiated and ships turned around in a season. Gradually, the most profitable exchanges tilted toward the coast. That didn't destroy Angkor, but it eroded one of its key advantages, the ability to sit astride the richest flows of goods in the region. Other centres, Ayutthaya in the Chao Phraya Basin, emerging Thai and Lao polities, coastal Cham and Vietnamese powers, began to compete for, and then capture, the trade that had once reinforced Angkor's dominance. Meanwhile, inside the Khmer world, politics were not calm. Angkor's inscriptions tell stories of kingship, conquest, temple endowments, pious donations. Read between the lines and you also find rebellions, usurpations, shifting alliances with powerful neighbours. Rival courts in the region were getting stronger, more organised, more willing to test Khmer borders. For a state like Angkor, war was both a tool and a drain. Victorious campaigns could bring slaves, tribute and prestige. But maintaining armies, building fortifications and defending long frontiers sucked resources out of the same system that was supposed to keep the reservoirs dredged, the canals repaired, the temples supplied. Every time power changed hands violently, bureaucracies were disrupted. Patronage networks shifted, projects were abandoned halfway, and then restarted under the next ruler with a new dedication inscription carved over the old one. Now lay a climate on top of that. The grand water system that had fed Angkor was designed to smooth out seasonal variability, capture monsoon rains, hold them in immense beret, distribute them through a spiderweb of canals. But it was still tuned to a climate with certain expectations. Paleoclimate data, lake sediments, tree rings from the wider region, suggest that from the 14th century onward, mainland Southeast Asia was hit by episodes of extreme variability, decades of severe drought punctuated by years of violent flood-heavy rains. In a normal monsoon, Angkor's system could buffer the city. In a series of abnormal monsoons, it was stressed in new ways. Droughts meant reservoirs falling too low, silt concentrating, crops failing on the margins. Sudden massive rains meant water tearing through embankments and canal banks, eroding channels that had taken generations to perfect. Archaeologists have found evidence of late-period modifications, hasty-looking channels, ad hoc diversions that suggest engineers were trying to rewire the system on the fly to cope with water that arrived in the wrong amounts at the wrong times. When your city's basic metabolism is water management, climate variability isn't just bad weather, it's a systemic shock. And while all this was happening in earth and sky, the ideological foundations of Angkor were shifting too. For centuries, the state's labour, surplus and prestige had been organised around a particular religious political synthesis. Kings as god-kings or universal monarchs, Shiva or Vishnu embodied on earth, with massive temple mountains as the axis between heaven and the realm. That ideology justified enormous mobilisations of labour. It made sense to carve whole hillsides, stack millions of stones, maintain elaborate ritual calendars, because these acts were not just piety, they were cosmology, politics, and public works rolled into one. Over time, however, Theravada Buddhism spread through the region, carried by monks, texts, and networks linking Lanka, the Mon world, and mainland polities. It didn't erase older deities overnight, but it did offer a different vision of authority and salvation, less about a single divinized ruler at the cosmic centre, more about individual merit-making, monastic communities, and simpler built forms. You can see the transition in the archaeological record. Temples repurposed, images recarved or supplemented, new kinds of shrines appearing among the old towers. This religious and institutional shift matters, not because one faith is stronger than another, but because it changes where resources go. If devotion and legitimacy no longer require monumental stone complexes on the same scale, then the political will to keep every canal aligned with an ancient temple grid weakens. Labour gets redirected to monasteries, local stupas, village-level projects, royal foundations in new locations. The state that built Angkor Wat was not the same state, ideologically or administratively, that tried to keep the city going 2 or 3 centuries later. So did Angkor collapse, or did it transform? Evidence points hard toward a drawn-out, uneven decline rather than a cinematic fall. There are signs of continued occupation in parts of Angkor long after its political peak. Some temples show modifications and repairs into the 15th and even 16th centuries. People kept living, worshipping, farming in and around the old core. At the same time, we see clear indications that political authority and population density were bleeding away to other centres. Royal inscriptions begin to mention different capitals. Chronicles describe kings moving court downriver, closer to the Mekong and the sea. Archaeological surveys pick up growth in new urban nodes, especially in areas better positioned to tap into maritime trade and to defend against rising Thai and Vietnamese powers. Think of Angkor not as a city that suddenly died, but as a capital that was gradually outcompeted and redirected. As climate stresses exposed the fragility of its water machine, as trade flowed toward coastal ports, as new rivals squeezed its borders, and as religious institutions evolved, the logic of concentrating everything in that one great jungle metropolis weakened. Power followed opportunity. Courts relocated, elites invested in new palaces, new temples, new networks. Commoners and specialists migrated along those currents seeking security, land, and patronage. Angkor's vast urban fabric didn't vanish in an instant. It thinned, frayed, and, over generations, ceded its primacy to younger centres that mapped better onto a changing world. By the time Europeans were finally in a position to hear more than rumours about the place, Angkor was already mostly a memory within Cambodian political geography, a sacred landscape, a storehouse of myths and stones, but not the beating heart of a living empire. Which is why, when the jungle finally closed over the canals and towers, the world beyond didn't register a single catastrophe. What happened instead was quieter and stranger, a metropolis slowly stepping out of the way, while history's stage lights tilted toward new cities, new routes, and new centres of gravity. Centuries later, when outsiders came looking, they would not find a fallen Rome with its story neatly preserved. They would find traces of those long decisions written in embankments, tree roots, and half-buried causeways, and have to reconstruct how a city that large could dwindle until it seemed to vanish. Angkor was never truly lost to the people who lived around it. Local communities kept visiting, praying, farming in its shadow. Monks maintained monasteries in and around Angkor Wat. Kings in later centuries restored shrines, sponsored rituals, folded the old temples into new religious landscapes. What got lost was something else, the scale. By the time overseas visitors began writing about Angkor, they were usually encountering a cluster of spectacular stone monuments emerging from forest and rice fields. They saw towers, bas-reliefs, moats, Naga balustrades. They did not see a city of 1,000 square kilometres, so the early rediscovery stories feel lopsided. 17th century accounts by visiting Japanese pilgrims, for instance, marvel at Angkor Wat as a sacred site, but say little about a surrounding metropolis. 19th century French explorers describe a kind of tropical Gothic, tree roots strangling towers, mysterious faces in stone, a lonely temple city swallowed by jungle. It made for great adventure narratives and romantic paintings. It also quietly shrank Angkor in the Western imagination, from the core of a vast urban system into a ruin in the forest, a Cambodian Machu Picchu before Machu Picchu. Archaeologists in the early 20th century pushed past that first impression. They cleared trees from temple courtyards, recorded inscriptions, mapped causeways and moats. They realised that Angkor was not just Angkor Wat and Bayon. It was a cluster of monumental complexes linked by engineered water and roads. But they were still mostly working at ground level, in a tropical environment that does not like to give up its secrets. If a neighbourhood was made of wood on earthen mounds and those mounds became rice paddies or low scrub, how do you see it from the forest floor? If a canal has half filled with sediment and is now just a slightly wetter depression in a field, how do you distinguish it from a natural stream bed? From eye height, Angkor was a landscape of fragments and guesses. That started to change with new ways of looking from above. Aerial photographs during the colonial period already hinted at a bigger story. Faint linear traces, rectilinear features, regular ponds scattered in patterns that did not look accidental. Later, declassified spy satellite imagery and higher resolution commercial satellites added more layers. Researchers could trace embankments, enclosure walls, alignment of features far beyond the temple cores. Field surveys and excavations followed these clues, confirming that many of those lines were man-made, roads, dikes, occupation mounds, reservoir edges, but the method that finally cut through the jungle's disguise was LiDAR. LiDAR, light detection and ranging, fires pulses of laser light from an aircraft down toward the ground, then measures how long they take to bounce back. Most pulses hit leaves and branches, but some slip through gaps in the canopy and reach the surface. With enough passes and clever processing, you can strip away the vegetation in your data and see the bare earth beneath, in astonishing detail. When researchers flew LiDAR over Angkor in the 2000s, the results were jarring. Suddenly, the temples we thought of as isolated masterpieces sat in dense, planned landscapes. The maps lit up with grids of small embanked mounds, probable house platforms, stretching out from the temple enclosures in organised patterns. You could see neighbourhood layouts, blocks and streets, not just random huts scattered around sacred centres. Long, straight features resolved into engineered roads and dikes, some running arrow straight for kilometres, binding different temple clusters into a single network. Subtle terraces and linear embankments marked ancient canals and diversion channels, many previously unknown, feeding and draining reservoirs in ways that suggested a much more intricate hydraulic system than anyone had fully mapped. Beyond the known core, LiDAR revealed entire subsidiary centres, temple complexes with their own gridded surroundings, woven into a continuous urban fabric. The city was not a single dense blob, but a sprawling low-rise metropolis blending into its agricultural hinterland. This didn't hand us a neat answer like, Angkor had exactly X 100,000 people. What it did was change the questions. Population estimates, once based heavily on intuition and a few excavated areas, could now be anchored in counts of house mounds, pond densities, and the spatial logic of road and canal networks. Some earlier guesses suddenly looked too small, others too simplistic. Debates sharpened. How many people per mound? How many mounds were occupied at once? How did density vary over time? The same went for understanding Angkor's extent. Instead of drawing a hard boundary line around the city, researchers began speaking more about urban regions, about a continuum from dense temple neighbourhood clusters to sparser, still-planned landscapes tied into the same water system. LiDAR didn't erase uncertainty. It made that uncertainty more precisely framed, and it drove home a larger lesson. Angkor had been hiding, not because it was invisible, but because we weren't yet asking the landscape the right questions at the right scale. The embankment you drive over on a country road, the oddly straight tree line, the pattern of ponds in a rice field, these can be the last visible traces of an urban machine that once fed, housed and organised hundreds of thousands of people. Angkor's rediscovery wasn't a single moment when someone hacked through vines and gasped at stone faces. It has been a slow, cumulative shift in perspective, from temples to systems, from ruins to regions, from picturesque jungle scenery to a palimpsest of human engineering written into the land itself. And once you realise that a city of that size can sit half concealed in the forests of Cambodia for centuries, it forces a final question. What else, in other landscapes we think we know, might still be waiting just under the surface? So let's zoom back out to that date on the thumbnail, 1200 AD. In most schoolbook versions, that's a story with a very narrow stage. You get cathedrals rising in France, Crusader states in the Levant, Chinese dynasties on the far side of the map, maybe Tenochtitlan as a bonus if the curriculum is feeling generous. The mental globe has a bright ring around Europe and the Mediterranean, a few spotlighted empires elsewhere, and a lot of dim, empty space in between. Angkor blows a hole in that picture. In 1200, while Paris is a dense-walled town on the Seine, and London is still half timber and mud, Angkor is already a mature urban region, hundreds of square kilometres of engineered landscape, a water system tuned to monsoon rhythms, road networks binding villages, shrines and rice fields into something that behaves like a single machine. Its scale matters because it tells us what medieval states could do. You don't casually move that much earth, coordinate that many reservoirs, or maintain that many kilometres of dikes without bureaucracy, logistics and shared ideas of authority. Angkor shows that state power in the medieval world wasn't just castles and tax rolls. It could be written into the soil, in embankments and canals that quietly manage risk for hundreds of thousands of people. But it also warns us. The same complexity that lets you buffer against ordinary droughts can turn into a liability when the climate shifts beyond your design assumptions, or when political will to maintain the system fractures. Big, integrated infrastructures don't just fail in one corner, they propagate problems. Angkor's story sits right on that knife edge between resilience and fragility, and it forces us to ask what we even mean by progress. For centuries, historians treated the places that left lots of stone and parchment as the main characters, and everybody else as background. Angkor complicates that. Here is a city that was bigger than any European counterpart of its day, that solved sophisticated engineering problems, that organised huge populations, and then became almost invisible in the narratives written elsewhere. So when we say the Middle Ages, are we talking about a global tapestry of different experiments in how to live together, or just the few threads that happen to leave records Europeans could read? If a city like Angkor can vanish into the jungle and only re-emerge as a metropolis once we invent lasers and satellites, what other urban worlds, on floodplains, in drylands, under later development, might still be half erased on our maps? How many empty landscapes are actually the ghosted remains of different ways of being urban? If you've stayed with this story all the way here, you're exactly the kind of person I made it for. Please take a second to like the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love seeing the spread of places this channel quietly connects. And if you're curious about other deep time surprises, about prehistoric bottlenecks and vanished experiments in being human, you might like the book I've been working on about those hidden chapters. You can read more about it or pick up a copy at sleepytimehistory.com. Because Angkor isn't just a lost city in a jungle, it's a reminder that the medieval world was never a single story, and that our map of the past is still very much under construction.